Good afternoon. Welcome to Senate Education. It is Friday, April 8th, 1:32 in the afternoon. We are going to now start to jump into our work, hearing from witnesses on H727, an act relating to the exploration, formation, and organization of union school districts. Ms. Russo-Savage.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Well, she's connecting. For those watching and for those in the room, we have done our walkthrough with Ledge Council, Ms. St. James, who is with us today as well. The plan is to probably go until 4 o'clock today, I'm guessing, depending on how long it takes for us to get through our witnesses. At the end of the day, we need to finish and have a few words with Patrick Holliday from the Agency of Education on 7/16. So with that, Ms. Russo-Savage, are you there? Ms. Gleason, we see you. We have you up second from the State Board. Great to see you. We're just going to see if Donna is there. Otherwise, we will indeed start with you.
Thank you. I think she was also waiting to get in. So.
Okay. It's hot in here. I'm okay. Yeah.
Hi, am I able to be heard now?
We can hear you.
Okay, I was being told that I couldn't unmute myself, and then suddenly I was able to. Let's see if I can get my camera on. There we go. Now I can get my camera on. Sorry, there was a message that I wasn't allowed to unmute myself.
Daphne's always playing tricks with all of us. No, she's not.
Not fair with me.
Thanks for being with us. So as you know, we have now gone all the way through H727 at our one-time walkthrough. And you're here representing the Agency of Education and wondering the agency's position on various parts.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'd like to be very, very brief so that Ms. Gleason has time to talk about what the State Board is concerned about. What I just would like to highlight a couple of things that I actually said to you before you began to walk through this. The bulk of Chapter 11, both as it is currently enacted and as it is in H727, is concerned with the creation and then once created, the operation of union school districts. Current statutes are confusingly drafted, they're incomplete, and they're focused primarily on union high school districts and union elementary school districts. Prior to 2015, that wasn't a major concern because at that time there were approximately 270 school districts in the state and only 20% of them were a union school district of any type. Almost all of those were union high school districts, which the current law is drafted to address. Prior to 2015, there were only 2 unified union school districts in this entire state out of 270 districts. Only 2 districts in the state were unified union school districts that operated pre-K through 12. Fast forward to now, there are 47 unified union school districts in the state, which represent over 40% of all school districts. All school districts of any type, town districts, union school districts. So over 40% of the districts in the state are now trying to use statutes that are incomplete, confusing, and not drafted for them. We spend, and the Secretary of State's office spends, a lot of time with attorneys and with local school board members and superintendents trying to answer questions where those answers just don't exist. So our experience, the agency's experience of both helping districts consider whether they wanted to merge, helping them go through the process of creating union school districts, and then now helping 47 or nearly 47 of those unified union school districts are new, helping them try to navigate their operational changes for them with these statutes. We decided it was a good idea to create an informal working group to to say, okay, if we were to start from square one, use current law as it exists, but organize it and fill in the details, what would we do? And what you have in front of you as chunk one is largely what the working group developed. Where we provided additional detail, we looked at current education law, current election law, and what was just happening as a practical matter in the field. We didn't address certain issues, and most specifically withdrawal, because those statutes are so extremely deficient in the way they're currently drafted. Anything that we would have done would have involved making a lot of policy decisions, and we did not feel as though we wanted to step into that. That wasn't our role. So I did want to say that the policy document that we provided, I heard a couple of times it mentioned when you were discussing things as the agency's proposals or recommendations. The policy document was simply, it did two things. If the working group did make a decision that we felt like it stepped over the line into policy, we noticed that in the policy document. And then other instances where we thought, this is something that maybe we might want to draw the legislature's attention to, because maybe they might want to consider doing something else. And some of those instances, we included some examples of things the legislature might want to do if they decided to address that issue. But in no way should you be thinking that policy document are our recommendations or something we're promoting. We do feel very strongly, however, both the agency and I believe I can speak for this informal working group, that the changes for what you've considered as chunk one and also for whatever you decide for withdrawal is very necessary, because the current statutes are, to be very blunt, are basically useless for most of the districts in the state. I do want to mention again, I mentioned it the last time, that because the working group hadn't discussed withdrawal in detail other than to identify what was deficient in those statutes, but we hadn't come up with any proposals ourselves. It wasn't until fairly recently that we realized that although there are statutes for employee transition when a new union school district is being created, there aren't any statutes for when a district is created by withdrawing from a union school district. I've been working with a group as a draft person, with a group of interested parties to try to take what's already in statute for transition and merger situations and create something similar for withdrawal. I believe that the interested parties are very, very close. There's just, I think, one small area that they're still trying to come to common ground on. I've drafted the language. I'm actually putting them on notice because I think they're all listening now. I really would like to be able to get this to the committee by Monday, because I think that it's important to be included and they need to have time to consider the language. So hopefully the parties will reach an agreement soon.
When you say the parties,
the people that I've been working with on the working group itself that we had worked with initially. The primary participants in the original working group were Will Senning and JP Isabel of the Elections Division at the Secretary of State's office. It was representatives from the School Boards Association, representatives from the Superintendents Association, and some private attorneys. We did try to keep the Teachers Association and the Principals Association in the loop, but there were the kinds of things that we were dealing with really didn't involve them as much, and so they weren't primarily involved. Now with this employee provision that I've been drafting for them, the people who've been participating have been folks from the teachers, from the NEA, Vermont NEA, from the School Boards Association, and the private attorney who was the most active attorney in the informal working group.
So there was no one in of the interested parties that you're trying to find some middle ground on. That doesn't really have anything to do with what different towns might be requesting or the withdrawals.
No, it's nothing. It's about how do you deal with the fact that you have a new district that doesn't have any employees, And those employees are all currently contracted to work from the Unified Union School District. How do you manage that transition when it's an entirely new entity?
So your plan is to come back to this committee early next week with some draft language?
I would love it if you would entertain that. Yes.
Great. Absolutely. Immediate questions for Ms. Russo Savage before I sort of jump in with a couple things. No. Donna, do you have more that you want to say at this point? Because what I'm hoping you would do is just weigh in on some of these. I mean, is the agency itself comfortable with the withdrawals, all of that work that has been put together? Do you have a position on that?
The agency's position is that we believe that something needs to be done. I don't believe that we have a position on the particular language. That is something that has been, I've been assisting the state board with, but that the state board has opinions on.
Okay. What's that?
Seems weird to me.
Yeah, it does seem a little surprising that the Agency of Education doesn't have a position on, I don't know, 30% of the bill. I'm not trying to, maybe, is this something that you could help us out with? Maybe get a position?
I know that there wasn't a position a couple of weeks ago. I can certainly
Okay.
Ask again to see if there is a position.
Okay, that would be helpful. And perhaps when we have you in next week, you could share that position with us.
Yes, I
Okay.
will. Thank you.
That's great. Ms. Gleason, seems like a good time. And Donna, can you stick around a little bit or?
Yes, I'll be here the whole time.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I do listen to the live streams every day when you're doing that as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Ms. Gleason, you're on the state board.
Yes, thank you. For the
Great
record,
to see you.
good to see you all. Thanks. And for the record, Kim Gleason, representing the State Board of Ed. And I've worked closely with Donna and Chair Olson. And we came to this body of work by our lived experiences, if you will, in entertaining withdrawal requests on the state board, and began a conversation with House Ed, working with Donna to put forth a proposal. We identified like 5 areas of particular concern. The current process lacked a requirement for analysis on the front end before the vote went to the electorate, created a chicken and egg situation where there was a vote and not a body to necessarily execute on behalf of the actions that were requested. We were being asked to approve or disapprove after a vote had taken place and without the analysis or the study, and really no tools to inquire further. And then the final consideration was one that I'm sure everybody's quite familiar with respect to Stowe in a, I don't know, forced merger, if you will, or a state created unification, whether or not we even had authority to take it up. And so we want to point to current law, I think, and its challenges. It does give us the authority to weigh in, but only after, and it gives us basically one question: will the students in the withdrawing town have a place to go to school that meets the educational requirements set forth by the State Board of Ed? And it is a pretty low bar for knowing whether or not, depending on where they would land with respect to the full scope of services offered for students, how that could be sustainable. And so I think that is an important recognition. It does let us say no after a vote has taken place, but with only one tool in our toolbox, and it's really inadequate for the job. And it's inadequate to ensure success for students or those districts moving forward. We strongly believe that the process should mirror the thoughtful study that goes into unification and is required in the law for unification. In that, we're charged with approving the study committee report, and there may be a lot of back and forth. And if we find that that is adequate for the formation, then it goes before the voters. And that is the way the process is in law currently for mergers. So we appreciate that the legislation, as it's been crafted and evolved, it is different from our original proposal. Ours definitely had more specificity, but I think ultimately a good piece of this is achieving what we had hoped, thoughtful study with some clarity around what's expected of that study. So, and the process does more closely mirror, though not exactly, the process for unification, gives more clarity over the roles and responsibilities through the process. It requires sort of a vote or an opinion of the State Board of Ed. I think we have some concern about an advisory role in it, in that we're not certain what value that adds. I think there may be an opportunity to at least weigh in on where we would, a preliminary decision on perhaps where, what SU the district would be placed in, or how that SU would be configured. But that even, I think, we're just not sure what that purpose is, except that would likely, if it were to be evaluated based on an assumption about where they would land, require a more thorough financial analysis before that would go to the voters, regardless of the opinion of the state board. And then, we really are looking to do our best to ensure, not stand in the way of this, but to ensure that if these are moving forward, they're established in a way that it sets it up for success for the students and the communities. And that really is our purpose. We are not particularly wed to being the deciding body. We happen to be in the merger process, and I think that served an important role as you all, in time that predated my time on the State Board of Ed, navigated through Act 46. But similar to withdrawals or dissolutions in other municipal bodies, those are approved by the legislature. So it seems important that there be a statewide perspective, I think, considered in these matters. And I think we are less wed to that having to be the State Board of Ed. I would say, I guess, the wise words of a colleague and leader among us, it shouldn't be more difficult to get married than to get divorced, and the current system establishes it in that way. So,
Are you saying the current system, it's harder to get married than divorced?
Yes, the
And that's
merger
what-
process
that's
as it
what we're
currently
okay.
stands
Yeah,
is
I see.
much more involved than one's request to remove themselves from their relationship.
Okay.
And we certainly, required very thoughtful consideration through budget votes and matters where we really, there are fully vetted proposals that go before voters on matters of voting on budgets, for instance, on withdrawals that happen village from town, or other municipal changes happen with an authority and approval from a statewide perspective. And the legislature offers that in many of those cases. In this case, the state board, as current law is written, has inadequate tools to do, I think, an appropriate job in this case.
So you're not recommending at this point any changes in the document that the House sent over to us?
Not specifically so. There is a side-by-side document that points out sort of where our initial proposal was and where this has evolved to. Again, I think we are less concerned about the how than the what. We need to ensure that the study is thorough and has specific standards required of it. I think that this version, and I'm going to ask Donna to hop in if I'm capturing it wrong, but I believe that primarily this does that. I think we do have reservation and concern about it, the advisory role, and that it may go to the voters with we're not seeing that this is set up for success opinion. And we're not exactly sure what value that adds, nor could we necessarily anticipate the effect that might have on a vote with a yay or nay from the State Board of Ed, for instance. That we can imagine that to either compel people in one direction or the other, just by virtue of our yes or no.
So I appreciate reminding us that, yes, we have the side-by-side here, but again, you're not pushing to go back to anything at this point.
No. And I think that the evolution more towards the what must ultimately be learned through the process of study was critically important to us. The notion that study happened before the vote was critically important to us. Our role where it sits in there and as it's written now, I don't think we have a specific suggestion for what happens with it, but I am flagging for all of you concerned regarding an advisory role. And I think echoing our concern that there be a statewide perspective considered in these ultimate requests to withdraw. These are municipal bodies, and a withdrawal from a municipal body in all contexts requires broad statewide consideration.
Do you have the bill in front of you?
I do it, and it's full 171 pages, or just the withdrawal?
Yeah, I'm looking at page, what I think, I'm hoping might be 71. I'm looking in chunk, I'm going through some of the questions that,
Okay.
or the parts that were raised by committee members, and it'd be
Okay.
good to have Ms. Russo Savage on here as well. Let me just get my full. So I'm going to need a little help here, I think, from Ledge Council. The question is on page 71 of chunk one, actually. Daphne, do you have extra copy of the full bill?
Not the full bill, but I could just one.
That's okay. We just have the full bill, but not right now.
Okay.
This is the question for me is Senator Lyons asked, this is about vacancies on unified school district boards. And Senator Lyons, I think, had asked who should be supporting this work. And that was going to be a question for Agency of Education. Do you have that marked as well?
I don't have anything about supporting the work.
Okay. Do you have anything else? I just have one.
I think there was a question about what spurred the session law that some of this language is based on. Are we looking, so we're on section 731, I'm sorry, that's St. James Office of Legislative Counsel.
Yeah.
We're on section 731, correct?
I think I've got it right here. So I'm just trying to figure out, I'm on page, we're in section 731, that's right. That's passed by the House. And I just had a question here for the Agency of Education from Senator Lyons, who is asking who should support some of this work, but, oh, I'm sorry. Who should appoint? Is that, that's what I have, okay. So what was your exact question?
Oh, I think there was a question.
Section, in the chunk one, page 71.
I think there was a question about what spurred the
session law.
change here.
Okay,
So current law is there's a requirement that the select board appoints for a vacancy.
yes,
If that seat is tied to a specific town. And there's been session law around for several years that changed that to consultation with the select board and with the school board making the appointment. And I think there was just a question about what caused that change to happen, what spurred that.
Ms. Russo Savage, is that something?
Well, I had actually was no longer Ledge Council, had that year, I believe, moved to the Agency of Ed. I believe that it was Ms. Gleason's district that asked for it. And so perhaps she can talk about it.
Okay. Ms. Gleason.
I'd be happy to, yes. I'm the former chair of the Essex Westford School District Board and co-chair before that with Martha Heath. And we worked on ensuring that was the case in our unified school district of Essex, Essex Junction, and Westford. We do have sort of representation on the board from each of those three communities, and sought to ensure that we would have the opportunity to appoint when there were vacancies. In my tenure, we had a few occasions to do so, and did that in consultation with the select boards of those towns, and established a thoughtful process that let us replicate that each time that came before us. We did have a few occasions to do that. And that worked well for us. We felt it really important versus not having a sense of what the work is, perhaps on a school board relative to a select board, and the beneficial process that a school board could take on and again consult with those select boards. It worked for us well. It was important to us, and we as it continued to be updated through session law and revisited through session law, it was with the anticipation. It wasn't that there had been pushback so much as it was with the anticipation of the rewrite on Chapter 11. So in our experience, that's in my old hat in Essex Westford School District, that's where I understand that to have come from.
Thank you.
And the working group included what was in session law in its proposal because that was the most current law.
Donna, can you go to section 732? This is the Unified Union School District Budget Preparation and Authorization. There was a question from someone around the table at one point, that last bit where it says plus 1%.
Yes, I can.
Look to you. Can you just remind us of what's happening in this section?
Sure. So if the voters do not approve a budget, so we're on page or on section 732.
And if for senators who are following in chunk 1 to page 74.
Correct. If voters do not approve a budget, this section, subsection C, is authorizing the board to borrow a certain amount of money, or giving them the authority to do that. And the amount of money they can borrow is the most recently approved budget of the Union School District in its first fiscal year of full operations, meaning the cumulative budget amount of the most recently approved school budgets of all districts that merged to form the union. And then the plus 1% was added.
And I believe that was the plus 1% came from the agency, Donna?
Not exactly.
Okay.
The working group's proposal to the legislature was to have the current language, which is what's in the first sentence of subsection C, that if the voters don't approve a budget, then you can borrow a certain percentage of the prior year's budget. Because in its first year of operation, a new unified union school district does not have a prior budget. The working group had put in language that is essentially what you have there on lines 12, well, essentially up until the plus 1%. So to say that for the purposes of the first year, the prior budget is the cumulative budgets of all of the other merging districts in the prior year. We included in the policy document, if you think it would be simpler to do it, you could just insert some other budget that will take the place rather than giving them borrowing authority in that first year. You could just say, if you can't come up with a budget until you do in your first year, the budget is some amount. And then in a parenthetical, we said, for example, you could say it's the cumulative amount plus 1%. So it was just kind of an example of that, this is something that you could do if you wanted to. The House Education Committee thought that 1% was a good idea and added it to the borrowing authority, or the amount that you base the borrowing authority on instead.
Okay.
I don't know if that's clear or not.
It's helpful. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Ms. St. James, but anything else that you think that you feel like the committee was flagging and had particular questions on for the agency?
I have.
Do you have one? Okay, Senator Pursley.
I don't know if this helps, if you're looking at the same document, the bottom of page 55 over to page 56, there was new language about the state board being able to
Yes.
change.
Because this is in chunk one, so this is section 719, supervisory union, supervisory district. I think the question was, what's the problem that folks are trying to solve with
Yeah,
this?
I just have a question mark, and then I said, I have a note, wondering what AOE, if this was an AOE suggestion, because there seemed to be,
Yeah,
I don't know
this
if
was.
you could just look at it.
Yes, and I can explain the situation. This was actually something that was in the working group's policy document as something to consider adding. The situation is this, that in current law, the state board has full authority to change supervisory union boundaries. It also, if a supervisory union board comes to it, it can change some of the ways in which a supervisory union is structured. For example, current law says that every district that is part of a supervisory union, if it operates a school, it sends 3 of its elected board members to sit on the supervisory union board. If it doesn't,
Non-operating, just one.
Don, I don't know if you can hear us. We've lost you. Okay, now you're back.
Sorry. Maybe if I get rid of my camera, that'll help. So I'm not quite sure where I was, but there were situations that arose shortly after the mergers that recently occurred, where a unified union school district was a member district, where there was also a very small district that operated pre-K through, I believe, 8, and paid tuition for the remaining. And there were several districts, one of which was quite a large district.
Yeah, I don't know if that. Can you answer that?
So I think where
I'll get it
Donna is going, and Donna, I'm understanding the concept and the challenge. So the challenge is that you could have a supervisory union that's comprised of one very large unified school district that maybe is 80% of the students, and then separately have a couple of smaller school districts that each of which then would send 3. And the proportional representation then from that SU board would not be reflecting the students and their representation on that SU board. And so where that may be so disproportionate to those that it's serving, there's an opportunity to remedy that.
So can you
Am I getting that right, Donna?
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, that's exactly right. And the 2 things to remember is that representation on a supervisory union board does not need to be strictly proportional. and that's the reason that there are 3 from each operating district that sit on it. But there are times when, just as a practical matter, it feels disproportionate, where you have 2 very small districts that operate very small elementary schools, each having 3 members on the board, and then have a very large unified union school district that has 80% of the kids in the SU having 3 members on the board. The only way under current law that membership can be changed is if the SU board comes to the state board and asks for a change. But if you have 2 very small districts that each have 3 members and 1 unified union school district that has 3 members, you can see that it's possible that there might not be a vote of a majority of the supervisory union board to come to the state board to ask for that. So in the policy document, we had said this might be something that you want to address, and this might be one way to address it.
Senator Persley.
Donna, why would we not want to give the supervisory board the ability to change it? Maybe in addition to the state board? Or do you think that they just never?
They under current law, they have the ability, but they have to get the blessing of the state board. And I believe that's because it's up to the state board to create supervisory unions. So I'm guessing that because it is the state board's duty to create them, the legislature also gave the state board the ability to waive certain requirements. So under current law, the SU board can change it, but they need to come in and get that waiver from the state board, which I think it has always granted as far as I know.
Okay, so as long as they have that ability to at least change it and get a permission, I guess. But I just can picture a situation where they give maybe an unweighted representation of the small town because the small town requested that as part of like the articles of agreement. It's like, well, we're afraid of our small school being shut down, for example, so we want to have an equal representation. But the board can come in and say, no, you can't do that.
No, this is not in that situation. This is not a school district's board, which must have some form of proportionality. This is an SU board, which has no requirement of proportionality. And an SU board would not be deciding to close a school. That would be something that a school district board would be deciding.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. St. James, back to you. Any other questions that we've raised that you've noted, please?
You raised several questions on what we have been referring to as chunk 2, which is the withdrawal statute.
So I wonder if maybe what we do with that, and I'm looking for your guidance, do we start to hear from some of our witnesses? And while Ms. Russo Savage is on, we kind of, or in Ms. Gleason, we kind of all continue to have a conversation, or is it first best to hear from Ms. Russo Savage? And I'm thinking in terms of what's the most productive.
If you would like me to give you a reminder of what some of the questions were.
Sure,
that might help
that'd be great.
inform
Thank you.
Decision. So one of the questions was, the H727 does not contemplate a specific timeline within which the State Board of Education needs to issue its advisory opinion. That was one.
So let's start with that. That would be, I think, good for Ms. Russo Savage to weigh in on, or Ms. Gleason.
Am I? Yeah, I'm unmuted.
What
I
county
think
are you in, Donna? What county do you live in that has such bad service?
I live in Groton. I live out in the middle of
question.
nowhere. I live in the middle of nowhere, and my husband also works remotely, so we have problems sometimes.
Middle of nowhere in Montpelier.
No, Groton.
Wow.
Yeah, we live on Lake Groton. So, I think that is something that you could add. One of the problems that I could see is that even though it's not specifically stated, knowing how certainly how mergers worked, and also how the the withdrawals that have happened so far have worked. There has been back and forth that the state board has said, we're concerned about this aspect. Would you please go back and consider this aspect and come back to us with a response to it? So I think that if you were to put some sort of deadline, by which the state board had to come up with its advisory opinion, you might be curtailing the amount of back and forth that could occur that would make this a better proposal. I realize that this is relying on the state board's, good graces to go forward and do things the way that it should and not delay things. But it's also, I think, important to ensure that it's as good a proposal as possible.
I tend to, I agree with that. So we would flag that and put some language there, and then when we go through again, make that final decision.
You want to add some language
Add
to
some language.
create a timeframe?
Please.
Yep. Do you want me to go on to the next question?
Yes, please.
There was a question about why it is the superintendent that kicks off the withdrawal study committee process.
That is simply because it is a person who is around all the time. A school district and a school district's board may not meet until sometime in the future, and it is the superintendent is there, and the study committee is not an entity until in this draft until it's recognized by the school board. So it needed somebody to get it going and to warn the meeting for it. It could be changed. It was just very often, for example, in the merger process, it is the superintendent who warns the first meeting of the study committee. So it was just
Yeah.
the person
We'll stick with
chosen.
that. Thank you.
Yep.
The next question was related to what the withdrawal committee shall evaluate. There was a question or a statement on whether or not the first subdivision, if you're looking at chunk 2, that's page 3, if you're looking at the entire bill as passed by the House, I don't know the page number, but it's section 724, subdivision A1, I'm sorry, B1. The educational advantages and disadvantages, there was a comment that was vague, and should that be more specific?
I think that may have come from me. And I feel like I'm a little late to this party because it probably should have been part of Act 46. If it's the question that I'm thinking back to yesterday is, could we be setting some schools or some kids up moving into a situation where their educational opportunities are decreasing? And are we, in a way, I guess, I don't remember those original documents, Donna, on 46, but the intention was to improve education around the state and the educational advantages and disadvantages. Okay, so it's being laid out. What if it comes back and it says, based on this assessment, the disadvantages outweigh the advantages? And then I think one of my colleagues, perhaps Senator Chittenden, said maybe we should start to pull some of these out a little bit and actually ask some specific questions around what are the educational opportunities and what are some of the things that might be being lost. Senator Chittenden.
Yes, Chair, I did raise this, and I think the comment that led to the suggestion to parse out or split out more specific aspects other than the sort of the vague term of educational advantages and disadvantages, was that I think we had a sense that this was so focused on the technical processes and the financial implications for tax purposes that the students weren't necessarily at the center of the considerations. And that's where I thought maybe if we add additional advantages and disadvantages to be spoken to in the report of curriculum depth, athletic facilities, co-curricular offerings, special education offerings, technology depth, including computer labs and instructional facilities, as well as cafeteria services. But again, I don't know if it's necessary, but it seems like that would be force the body that considering this to really look at all of the whole student aspects.
So
please.
I think I have two separate comments on that. One is that the lead-in language that is on the previous page does refer back to the policy statement at the beginning of chapter 11, chunk 1. And it refers to throughout the document to the education quality standards, which are
Okay.
specific. The policy document, the policy statement at the beginning of chunk 1 does talk about substantial equity of educational opportunities statewide, leading students to achieve or exceed the state's education quality standards. So I do think in a general way, there is a little bit more detail than it perhaps first appears to be. You certainly could add more. The second comment I'd like to make is that I think that you're absolutely right that the state board could determine that the proposal could come forward saying they're outweighed, or the state board could determine that the negatives outweigh the positives. And what happens at that point when the state board determines that the negatives outweigh the positives is that it does go to a vote in the way that it's currently drafted. And if 60% of the withdrawing community approve it, despite the negative determination by the state board, and then the rest of the districts approve that withdrawal, it would go forward even if the state board determined that it would negatively affect the opportunities available to the students.
So I think we should flag that as a serious point of consideration for this committee that we could have next week on whether or not we really would want things to go forward if the state board determines, as Senator Shinn said, that it's, it could be bad for students. Ms. Gleason, did you want to say anything on that?
I was just going to sort of reflect back our concern regarding advisory versus something more definitive and the alignment with the process that happens for unification. In unification, if the study committee proposal is not deemed to be to the advantage of students and increasing educational opportunities or enhancing educational equity of opportunity, that would not go to the voters. So
that's very helpful. So, and I'm new in this particular role and wasn't as in the thick of 46 stuff. So you're saying under the unification stuff, if the state board had come out and said, hey, this not a good idea, educational opportunities are being lost, then it was done.
And Donna, please fact check me, but that's as I understand the unification required the report from the study committee and the articles that were going to be considered to go to the voters to have the approval of the State Board of Ed. And that also predates my time on the State Board of Ed. But I am quite certain that's what I had read and on the unification process.
That's correct. And there was in several instances back and forth where the state board said, no, this doesn't meet our criteria, please go back and come back to us with some more thoughts, and ultimately approved it, but not until changes had been made.
And we can talk more about this. I think what Senator Shinn is raising is a really good point, and I certainly would like to move in that direction, but Senator Persley.
Well, a counter to that is just local control. Like, so if the parents decide to vote for that, should they have the right to make that decision on their own for their own children and own citizens of their town?
Mm-hmm. Senator Shinn.
Haven't we circled this barn before, and that the state does have responsibility to ensure that our kids have equal access to educational opportunity? There's the tension.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there sounds like there was a lot of back and forth. I'm looking at Ms. Gleason. It sounds like when the unification stuff was happening, it sounded as though it was, hey, you guys aren't offering this. Come back and make sure you're offering this. Get it boosted up. Kind of working back and forth to get to a good spot.
I think it was that engaged type of process. And I think probably Donna was more intimately involved with it at that time. I, at that time, would have been on the study committee for the Essex Westford School District. And our study process was robust and very thorough. and required quite a bit of, I think by the time we arrived at our completed study, less back and forth at that point, but the study process itself was quite in-depth, and I think relied on technical support to understand what it needed to include as we were doing that work. And I know for that we would have been leaning into the resources at the agency. But yes, I think, Donna, is there anything else that can be helpful?
No, that's great.
Okay, Ms. St. James.
There were a couple places where the committee had questions that I think were flagged for the Secretary of State's office.
Okay.
There was one kind of hybrid between State Board and AOE and Secretary of State's office, and that is, looking for my red pen here. I believe it was about the last section of the withdrawal section, subsection J, timing of action, subdivision 2. For those following along by chunk, that's page 16. There was just a question about what was the policy behind limiting the time with which a petitioning town could seek a new withdrawal action.
This
if
is
it
chunk
had been-
2.
I'm sorry, chunk 2.
Oh.
This was something, I believe that the House included this in response to concerns raised by some of the superintendents who testified, and by the Superintendents Association and School Boards Association, a concern that if a group wanted to cause disruption because they didn't agree with the way in which the Unified Union School Board was proceeding with something, and it could be entirely separate from the issues that we've heard, like particular policies, I think were mentioned. If they were allowed to continually, this is going to take a lot of time and effort on the part of the central office staff to provide the data that the study committee needs, and it's going to be very disruptive to the work that they need to do to educate kids. And they were concerned that if there was a group that wanted to disrupt, they could just continually be bringing these requests to withdraw and tying up the resources of the central office. And I believe that that's where that came from that concern.
And I see Ms. Gleason is nodding. You're in agreement
Yeah,
there.
I would agree. And I think otherwise that revolving door never requires that there's an engagement with a unified commitment to the work of the unified district, allowing, I think it does both. It prevents there from being non-productive use of limited resources and encourages that this is a 2-year window. So I think leaning into understanding what opportunities could be realized through the unification would strike me as a better path than planning the next request to withdraw. And that just offers that window on both ends of the challenges to resources and the opportunity to realize the improvements that may come of a unification or otherwise.
Those are the only questions that I flagged, the committee raised specifically for AOE and the State Board of Education.
Committee, anything else right now before we jump in with some of our additional work on this? Okay, Senator Percy. Okay. So let's we're going to take a 5-minute break and come back. Let's say 9 minutes. We'll come back at 2:35, and then we'll jump in with Representative Sherman and Senator West